Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Josh. This has been me my whole career. I have been all excited about static analysis and lint rules because I think there's all sorts of great, useful, fun stuff you can do with them. I feel this warm, fuzzy feeling on the inside whenever I write this piece of code that the tool tells me is terrible and I should fix it. But understandably, most people have a different reaction when the tooling gives them these red squigglies. Most people have this reaction: fear, uncertainty, and doubts. Has anyone here experienced FUD with their dev tooling? Yeah. Fear, there's a red editor squiggly. Oh no, something's broken. Uncertainty, I don't know why it's angry, and I certainly haven't read the documentation to find out. And doubt, I know my code works. Shut up, VS Code. We're going to use it anyway. No more fudding it up. Today, we're going to learn about static analysis, and we're going to experience happiness and joy and confidence with it. Is everyone with me? Woo! Thanks. Because it's cool stuff, and it'll make you a star developer. So let's dive in. All right. I'm going to go through a bunch of nice, useful tools, but at the end, I'll show you some resources. You don't have to write any of this down. I'll give you links to everything. And the first set of tools I want to show off are actually in a tool, just show of hands, curiosity. Who here uses ESLint? Not everyone, and it's totally fine if you don't, but a lot of people, a majority. Yay. For those who haven't played with these things yet, a linter, such as ESLint in the JavaScript TypeScript land, is a tool that runs a set of discrete checks called rules, or lint rules, on your source code. Each one of those checks or rules may optionally find some code it doesn't like and give a complaint. And each of those complaints may optionally provide a way to fix or improve the code in some capacity. For example, you might have this piece of code, friend equals friend or me, with the built-in, as in it ships with ESLint rule, logical assignment operators. ESLint will look at your code and say, you silly goose, Joshua, you can actually write this in a nicer new syntax. Curiosity, who here has seen the or equals in JavaScript? You've all just learned something thanks to ESLint, except for those of you who raised your hands. Good for you. Yay, ESLint, woo! Now, fun fact, ESLint configurations can get big. There are a lot of different frameworks and rules you might want to pull in. So the nice ESLint folks created an @ESLint/config package that you can run with npx or pnpx or equivalent. And it'll set up an ESLint config for you. So if you haven't touched your repos .eslintrc in 10 years and you're getting a lot of squigglies, you might want to try making a new one. Now, at the very least, I recommend that ESLint has its own recommended set of rules. These are rules that the ESLint core team and a lot of contributors and collaborators online have figured out are generally the things that most projects want to enable. But if you don't like that exact rule set, if you want to customize it, which ends up happening in almost every project, you can always override specific rules. For example, you can take a rule that defaults to error, or give me the red squiggly, and turn it into a warning with the yellow squiggly, as we see here. Now, most of the time, this is not something you want to keep on forever, because semantically, what is the difference between a warning and an error? But it's a transitory operation. If you have 5 million violations of rule and you don't have the time to auto-fix all of them with ESLint --fix, it can be nice to get yellow squigglies. Fun fact, the actual difference between a warning and an error in ESLint land, the difference between this and error, is that if ESLint only sees warnings, it will not fail the build. It will not exit with status code 1, which can be useful if you just want to see that they're there. But over time, I have experienced that whenever someone leaves warnings on, you just get a bunch of yellow squigglies in your editor that no one ever fixes. So I recommend running ESLint with --max warnings 0, which says just treat the treat the warnings in build time in CI as if they should fail the build. So they might show up as warn yellow instead of error red, but they'll still fail your build. Yay, failing the build, woo! I also recommend, if you don't like the way a rule is working, you can always disable it on a per line, per block, per file basis. We saw in the ESLint config, you could just set it to off. That's totally okay if the rule doesn't work for you, which I realize is a revelation to some. ESLint is opinionated, but you can change those opinions. Or you can use what's called a comment directive to disable the rule on a line. For example, the built-in ESLint no console rule is very popular because most larger projects have their own fancy schmancy logger that they use. But if you really just want to meow on one line, that's totally okay. I also recommend that you enable ESLint's report unused disables directive flag, which says if you have left in a comment directive in a place that no longer would give you an ESLint rule complaint, that becomes its own error. Because let's say that you turned your meow into the fancy schmancy logger, and there's no longer a need for that ESLint disable next line comment. That comment's ugly, kind of intentionally. I do not like the look of it. It conveys that we're ignoring the linter. It just takes up space. So having ESLint give you a complaint that, oh, this is not necessary, it's kind of useful. It's what I'd call a hidden gem. Now, fun fact, ESLint will -- fix if you want. It'll remove auto-fixable complaints. And this is one of them, as of a couple ESLint versions ago. Yay. 2 more suggestions for ESLint. Just show of hands, curiosity. Who here uses VS Code? Again, almost everyone, but not quite everyone. Totally okay. There are a lot of good editors out there. But I like VS Code. One of the reasons I like VS Code is that it has really nice settings file support. You can check in a .vscode/extensions.json, which contains an array of, hey, if you're opening this in VS Code, let's give the user a little suggestion to use this extension, suggestions. And you can use that to suggest the ESLint extension, which is what gives you the little yellow or red squigglies from VS Code. I also recommend source.fixall.eslint true on your code actions, another VS Code option. You can check in a .vscode/settings.json to configure per repo settings. This says whenever you save the file, autofix ESLint complaints. I personally like to use ESLint plugins that sort everything. It's the most annoying experience for new contributors to my projects. I sort the imports. I sort the object properties. I sort the union types in TypeScript. It's very annoying unless you have a tool that sorts it for you, in which case it's kind of nice to be able to skim through them more easily. One more thing on ESLint, actually. Stop using ESLint for formatting. And this is extremely important and very relevant. So in 3 seconds, I'm going to repeat it, and you're all going to shout it with me. 3, 2, 1. Stop using ESLint for formatting! Thanks. ESLint comes with a bunch of old rules like indent and semi. These rules will help enforce semicolons, existing or not existing, or using 2 versus 4 spaces or tabs or whatnot. And that's not good. ESLint's gonna ship those away to some third-party configs, some third-party plugins, because a linter and a formatter are 2 separate tools. And it's only been, by the way, I think this is fascinating and so cool. It's only been the last few years, like 2 to 3 years in JavaScript, TypeScript land, that we've really started to hone in on the difference between the 2 of them in popular tooling. A formatter, such as Prettier or more recently dprint, is a tool that reformats all your code in one pass, or will just in one pass suggest to you how to reformat it, which makes it really fast. It just goes through your code all in one go, but it's not logical. It's not smart. It's intentionally a nice word for dumb, because it's not meant to deal with your logic. It doesn't care if your code is functioning correctly. It just cares that it's semantically valid, that it is syntactically correct code. Whereas a linter runs a set of discrete rules. There's an indent rule, and a max line length rule, and a semicolon rule, and they all produce fixes that don't know each other, which means if you're using a linter for formatting, your rules are going to continuously iterate upon the code over and over again in a very slow, annoying process that sometimes takes more than the maximum 10 allowed auto-fix rounds. So a linter is not good at formatting, and I would highly encourage you, if you're using ESLint for formatting, to stop doing that and to use Prettier or dprint instead, or an equivalent. I know biome is a thing now. And just furthering on this point, I'm one of the maintainers of Typescript-eslint, the tooling that lets you run JavaScript tools such as ESLint and Prettier on TypeScript code. And we've given up on the formatting rules, specifically indent. It's the worst. It's the absolute worst rule. It's annoying to implement. It's buggy as all heck. We're done. So that's all in ESLint. Let's talk about TypeScript-eslint instead. Woo! Curiosity, who here uses TypeScript-eslint? All right, like half the room, a little more. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it. So to recap what's going on with TypeScript and ESLint, JavaScript has a real problem. JavaScript doesn't have a way, a built-in language way, to describe the intent, the types of your code. If you have a code snippet like this, log and call, there's no built-in way to express which of these three statements, if any, are correct. And as humans reading this code, we can take a couple seconds to look through and see, OK, action seems to be a required param, so maybe that first one is incorrect. But at the tooling level, if you have a lot of files, JavaScript just is not good at declaring intent. We don't know if this is allowed, if it's maybe log and call is imported from somewhere else. Maybe log and call is correct, but what happens if later on you change it? So TypeScript adds in, among other things, a syntax for describing what type something is. This new TypeScript-eslint syntax here, the colon and so on, says action is a function that returns void, nothing, ignore the results. Show of hands, who here uses TypeScript? Yay, almost everyone. If you don't use TypeScript yet, that's OK. But talk to me if you want help onboarding. It's really nice. There are a lot of benefits. Now, ESLint does not natively understand that new TypeScript syntax. So if you're using TypeScript, you're going to have to add a little something to your ESLint config. ESLint allows you to describe parsers, such as the TypeScript-eslint parser. That's the thing that tells ESLint this is what that colon means, this is what that void means. But that's not all you can do. TypeScript-eslint is a whole project. We got all sorts of great stuff for you. And one of the nice things we have is an ESLint plugin, which defines a set of rules and preset configs that turn on a bunch of those rules at the same time. So if you're writing TypeScript code, I highly recommend linting with ESLint and then onboarding to the TypeScript-eslint recommended rule set too. These will check for things like using the right TypeScript constructs and not using deprecated stuff. But ESLint has a problem. ESLint, by default, natively, only understands the raw syntax of your code. Kind of like how JavaScript doesn't understand a syntax for describing your types, ESLint doesn't look at all your files at the same time. ESLint only looks at one file at a time and doesn't understand a type system. So while TypeScript understands what the code means and ESLint doesn't, TypeScript-eslint is what lets you merge the two together. So we have a set of rules called recommended type checked, which allow you to write ESLint rules that also tap into the awesome power of the TypeScript type checker. Just curious, has anyone here explicitly used recommended type checked yet? Like 3 hands. Thank you. So proud. These rules are awesome. These rules will not just validate the syntax of your code, but they'll validate that you're using types properly. And I'll just give you an example. Because so few of you raised your hands, this is going to be very exciting for many of you. We have a rule, it's one of my favorite, called await venable. This rule says that if you have an await statement in code, it should await something that is a venable, which is the JavaScript-y term for anything with a .then, most commonly a promise. As to whether we should call the rule await venable or await promise is a discussion that we keep going back and forth on. But await console.log, does anyone know what will happen if you await console.log? Correct, nothing. It's useless await, doesn't do anything. So the rule would correctly suggest, hey, you're doing something you don't need to, you're adding an extra async tick. Get rid of that thing. Yay. But that little contrived example isn't super useful. So let's look at a bigger one. And I fully am aware that not everyone here writes JSX or is frontend at all. So I'm just going to skim through it and just skip to showing you that that rule, return await, would let you know on the await on click. And if you're new to a project, I'm sure it would be real nice to have a tool scanning it for you so you don't have to read every single line of code to find, oh, wait, on click was declared as a function that returns void, nothing, ignore the results, but we awaited it. And now this is where it gets fun. The rule could, in theory, suggest to you, hey, you might want to make the onClick an async function, say that it returns a promise. That's one way of resolving the rule's complaints. Or if you know that this button is only ever rendered with a synchronous onClick, you could instead remove the await, which means then that your running state is unnecessary. Again, if you don't write front-end code, it's real nice to have the rule figuring this out for you, right? Which means then that the onClick and disable function is unnecessary because it's just running onClick, which means that your running state is unnecessary because the button is always going to be disabled, which means having button disabled equals false is totally unnecessary because it's always disabled, which means we are able to get rid of 1/3 of our code using TypeScript-eslint. Yay! Woo. Awesome. So in summary, that's all for ESLint, I promise. highly recommend working with your linter. There are a lot of really cute hidden gems in there, like return await, that will help you find bad code problems, little bits of unused code in your projects. So speaking of unused code, I like deleting unused code. Does anyone here enjoy deleting unused code? Yes. Mostly, and then a few like happy faces. TypeScript does have a couple of compiler options for this. One is no unused locals or local variables. And it'll detect that if you create a variable and then don't use it, hey, that's not allowed. But for me, that's not good enough, because TypeScript compiler options are all or nothing. They're not super configurable. You can't ESLint disable next line, a compiler option specifically. TypeScript has its own comment directives, but they're much less powerful than ESLints intentionally. There is this ESLint rule that we have in TypeScript-eslint that's TypeScript-e aware. But again, I would say that this isn't good enough, even though it has configurability and can be disabled per line. Because what if you have a function? What if someone on their last day is like, to heck with this group of people, and writes a function that's never used that throws an error? ESLint would not be able to tell you that this is unused code, even if it's never called anywhere, because it's exported from the file. And ESLint generally works on a file-by-file basis. And even more, if you had, let's say, like a type or an interface that maybe previously was used by a function and no longer is, sure would be nice to have a tool letting you know, hey, you don't need this anymore. Even though it's exported by the file, no one imports it. And my favorite little bit here, what happens if you added a dependency and then 3 years later realize this 300 megabyte dependency is no longer being used? That's the magnitude of how powerful this stuff can get. So there's actually a really nice tool for this with some of the best dev branding I've ever seen in an independent open source project. This is pulled straight from its README. It's called knip. Does anyone know what this means? I think it's Dutch for snip or something like that. Yeah, for cut? Thanks. I'm going to Amsterdam in a couple days. Hit me up if you... Yeah, so knip is an awesome tool. It's really nice. It's very straightforward to start using, but it's super configurable. Similar to ESLint, you can save it as a dev dependency, and then npx knip. It also has a config file. For example, this one is very similar to the defaults. It says the entry point of my project, where end users grab stuff from, is my index. And then the files I'm looking at, the project, are everything under source that ends with a TS. You can configure it for yourself. And I would posit that this is an extremely good thing that practically every long-term maintained project should use, because unused code is bad. We saw earlier that a third of the file was able to be removed in that theoretical buttons situation because the await was unnecessary. Just that one little keyword made a third of the file extra. Now imagine how many unused dependencies and interfaces and types and whatever are in your code. And the two main reasons why I seriously dislike unused code, one is that it makes the code, the source files, less readable. That if you have an extra quarter, third size, that's harder for new people to read. It's harder for everyone to make changes. And it's harder as time goes on to delete unused code, because you get these cruft layers built on top of each other, and it gets very difficult, especially when the dead code is never run, so you don't know how to verify that changes work. And they also slow down your builds. I have actually seen multiple 100 megabytes of node module size from unused code. That's, whatever, hundreds of hours over the course of a month or a year in CI install times. Who here likes waiting for CI to pass? Yeah, no. So, as the README says, knip it before you ship it. Cool. Oh man, my GIF isn't loading. Oh, no, it is. We're good. So, at this point, you've seen a lot of things. We've seen ESLint and TypeScript-eslint and knip, and that's just like the tip of the iceberg. There's all sorts of cool stuff that you could do in JavaScript land to configure and mess with your projects. And you might be feeling that's too much, man, because it is a lot to memorize. There are a lot of different tools out there. So, and this is just shameless self-promotion at this point, I wrote a thing called Create TypeScript App, which will set up all these different tools for you. I'll have this link at the end, and I should also note Joshua K. Goldberg is my Twitter, my Fostodon, my Blue Sky, my Twitch, my YouTube, my .com, and it has links to these slides on my website. So why set up a million configs if this thing already does for you? So I recommend check it out, npx create TypeScript app. It'll migrate an existing repo, which is kind of an experimental operation. Definitely back up your changes to Git first. or it'll create a new one for you. And it does a lot. It'll build your code with tsup, which is an awesome little utility in the TypeScript lands. It'll lint your code with ESLint and a bajillion different plugins. It'll test your code, shadow v-test. It does automated releases with releaseIt, which is a package made by the same person who made knip, so you know it's good. It's got knip. It's got, anyone see those tables in the readmes of the all contributors with the emojis? It's got that. It's got GitHub templates like issue and PR templates. It's got spell checking. It's got formatting on commit. It's got package duplication, which is actually a built-in feature to PNPM. There's a lot going on. And I personally feel conflicted about how much stuff goes into create TypeScript app in a lot of modern repos. Because as much as I'm enjoying talking about it, part of me dies a little having to explain 15 different tools. But I would posit that this is good. This is a rant. I think that it's actually net in many ways really good for the ecosystem that we have so many different tools that are so finicky and have their own opinions and ways of working. Because the alternative is to not. The alternative is to not have as many tools, to not have 15 different ways of linting or testing or whatever. But one of the key strengths of the JavaScript ecosystem, the things that Node, NPM, and so on have brought forth into the world, is that we can do a lot of different iterative approaches at the same time. We can investigate different paths. We can do Mocha and Jest and v-test all in the same decade. And we can find out what works out well for us. So I like that we're able to experiment and learn from each other's mistakes and wins and try all these wacky different approaches. Because I think each layer, whether it's linting or testing or spell checking, improves over time. We expose that there's a need in the ecosystem, such as linting or linting TypeScript or linting check TypeScript. We iterate on it. We learn what works or doesn't work. We learn from that iteration, we document it, and then we automate it for you. A really good example of this is Webpack. Has anyone here had to manually craft a Webpack config that was 500 lines long? Oh, can you imagine doing that in the year of our heavens 2023? Awful. But frameworks like Next.js and SvelteKit and everyone do it for you now. So I think this is wonderful. I think it's a whole new world of awesome tooling and utilities and things that we can work with. And I'm excited to be here with 9001 different test utilities. So let's recap everything that I went over, because there was a lot. We talked about ESLint. Yeah, ESLint, a few different CLI flags, some VS Code stuff. Talked about types linting with TypeScript ESLint. We deleted a third of a button. We talked about knip it before you ship it, and create TypeScript app with a rant. All these things are documented online. There are 2 websites here and then 2 general GitHub links. I mentioned I work on TypeScript ESLint, so I would highly encourage you to check us out, read our docs, and please give us money because we're an independent open source project and I make barely American minimum wage because I'm a full-time independent open source maintainer, which is a lot of fun. Always happy to talk about that. And if you want to learn more about me, I mentioned my tags on the slides, and I wrote a book, Learning TypeScript. I'm one of 2 people at this conference who wrote a book called Learning TypeScript, and I think both books are great. Thanks, everyone.